this intensification of the negotiation is also part of the, from the Russian side, is a part of the game to achieve the best position for Russia in the upcoming months as quick as possible.
Now, Donald Trump could walk away from the talks to try to end the war in Ukraine. That is according to his son, Donald Trump Jr. He was speaking to Sky News at a business forum in Doha and asked directly whether the US president would walk away from the peace process.
I think he may. What's good about my father and what's unique about my father is you don't know what he's going to do. The fact that he's not predictable, he's not following the playbook of every clown who's, again, been a bureaucrat for decades, you don't know. And so that forces everyone to actually deal in an intellectually honest capacity, which has not happened in far too long.
Well, those comments will add to the concerns of the so-called Coalition of the Willing, which is meeting tomorrow at Downing Street, chaired by the Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and it will include Ukraine's President Zelensky and other EU leaders. And those remarks are another conflicting signal from the US after Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, said talks with Ukrainian officials over the weekend had been constructive. Let's talk to Yevheniia Kravchuk, who's a Ukrainian MP and deputy chair of Volodymyr Zelensky's Servant of the People Party. Good afternoon to you, Yevheniia.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Really good to have you with us. I mean, what do you make of those remarks from Donald Trump Jr. suggesting that President Trump could still just walk away from this whole process? Do you think that that is a realistic prospect?
Well, it's hard to judge what President Trump could or not or could not do. But obviously, if he mentioned numerous times that he would love to have the Nobel Prize, well, obviously, walking out of the conflict does not bring that closer. And obviously, there will be questions from, politicians around the world, from people in the United States, because actually the United States had put some effort. And with regards to the position of the voters and just ordinary Americans, well, it looks like that the vast majority think that Russia could not or should not win in this war. And obviously walking out means just letting Russia putting more pressure on Ukraine.
And we've had several different rounds of these negotiations. We had Steve Witkoff, along with Jared Kushner, meeting President Putin in Russia. They've been meeting Ukrainian officials. We know that President Putin has also at the same time been saying that he's perfectly prepared to continue the war and indeed would be ready to go to war with Europe. Do you think in all of these negotiations there's any indication that President Putin is serious about negotiating peace?
Well, of course, if President, he's not really elected president, so the owner of the Kremlin, Putin, would want to end this war, he would just stop. Basically, it's everything that Russia needs to do, just stop. And Russia is actually running out of money. So I think that this intensification of the negotiation is also part of the, from the Russian side, is a part of the game to achieve the best position for Russia in the upcoming months as quick as possible.
And we had at the beginning,
yeah,
and sorry to interrupt you, but we had at the beginning of this process that 28-point peace plan, which was largely seen as really pretty unacceptable to Ukraine. It would talk about Ukraine giving up large swathes of territory that are not even occupied by the Russians, accepting limits on the size of its army, accepting no foreign troops on its soil, even Russian as the national language. That has now, we understand, been amended. We're down to 19 or 20 points. Are you any clearer as to whether there is a peace plan on the table that would be acceptable to Ukraine?
Well, first of all, I would have to say that the negotiations that happened at first in Geneva, then in Miami, actually are, bringing us to this just peace. Indeed, the 28 points plan that caused a lot of anxiety, not just in Ukraine, but in Europe as such, now had turned to the 1920. It's not officially published, so we, as members of the parliament, haven't seen it. But from the official comments, we understand where, the red lines lay. And, our arguments are being taken from the American side, and Americans understand. But again, as we saw from very limited comments of Kushner and Witkoff after the meeting in Moscow with Putin, that, the breakthrough wasn't achieved. And every time Russia is the problem. I'm sure that at the end of the day, we will be able to find some security guarantees between the partners. Obviously, United States will come up with some sort of commitments from their side. And, we're waiting also for this meeting tomorrow in London of the Coalition of the Willing. But
yes, I wanted to ask you about that.
Has to be pushed and pressured more, I would say.
I wanted to ask you about this meeting of the Coalition of the Willing in London tomorrow, chaired by Keir Starmer. I mean, that is about trying to find countries that could provide security guarantees if there is a peace in future. But if you've got Russia saying that it's not going to accept the presence of any foreign troops in Ukraine, objecting to any potential for Ukraine to ever join NATO, is there any point to this Coalition of the Willing meeting? Can that ever actually provide security guarantees if President Putin is adopting that stance?
Well, it's actually a good question, because it says a lot about the self-esteem of European countries. The GDP of Russia is the same as GDP of Germany. Russia is not producing anything rather than weapons and fossils. That's actually where the money comes from. So if you would look, on the whole situation, it's one country trying to threaten much more powerful countries and trying to take out their sovereignty, because forbidding other countries basically saying you cannot have troops or you cannot have the yes to Ukraine in NATO, meaning that Russia is stealing part of sovereignty of these very powerful countries. So I think it has to be an honest answer whether Europe is capable of taking its own security seriously.
Let me just ask you finally, we've had this huge corruption scandal in Ukraine. It's led to the departure of Antony Yermak, who was President Zelensky's closest advisor. Do you think that has undermined President Zelensky's position? And do you agree with other Ukrainian MPs I've spoken to who say that President Zelensky will not be re-elected when we come to an election, if we ever get to the point when the war is over?
Well, I think that President Zelensky is now concentrated not on re-election, but actually on receiving just peace for Ukraine. I think it's his primary goal on which he works every day. And about the corruption scandal, well, it just proves that anti-corruption bodies in Ukraine work, and there are no untouchable people. I think that was an ultimate goal when we created the anti-corruption bodies, that if there is corruption, and corruption happens in different countries. You probably saw the case with Ms. Mogherini, the higher representative of EU that was not long ago, was pressed with charges. But at the end of the day, it matters whether the corruption is being fought. Well, the anti-corruption bodies has the full independence in Ukraine and can catch and punish anyone.
Yevheniia Kravchuk, it's been great to talk to you. Thank you so much for
Thank you for having
us.
me, Carol.